The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to another episode of Voices in Validation. We're so glad you could be here with us today as we talk about change control for existing products. And to help us understand that process more, we have with us today Alan Golden. He's the principal of Design Quality Consultants and certainly a 30-plus year veteran of the industry, knows a lot about this topic, and we're so happy to have you here with us today, Alan.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So very quickly before we hop into it, just for our listeners following along, the manufacturing environment, I should say, change may refer to any modification in equipment, materials, facilities, processes, packaging, labeling, you name it, and on and on. Global regulatory requirements for change control are essential to patient safety and product quality. But as we've heard previously, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. Every product, every facility, every process is different and will require different actions or reactions. But Alan, I know a lot of the general rules and processes will apply in many instances. So let's start, if you will, from the beginning, with a brief review of the product lifecycle and talk about when change control starts and ends for a product.
Sure. Well, product lifecycle starts at literally the conception of a product right at the very beginning when somebody in R&D or marketing or scientific affairs gets an idea for a product. That's where the product lifecycle starts, and it ends when that product is eventually removed from the market. Either it's been superseded by another product for the same company, it runs out of patent protection, but for whatever reason, it's removed from the market. And a lot of people think of the product life cycle as sort of four distinct phases. There's this conception phase, like I said, where some genius comes up with a new idea for a product. Then there's the phase I call feasibility, which again are typically the scientists and engineers working to begin to take that concept and formulate it into something that might be feasible to use as a product. Once you get through that stage, there's typically some type of review process, and management says, okay, we've got something that could be a product, and then it moves into the development phase, where now you're starting to getting into things like validation and all the documents that are needed to build the product. And the sort of the final in a medical device universe, which is the universe I spent most of my career in, you're looking at verification and validation of all your product requirements and that kind of thing. And then finally, you're going to market your product. You've passed all that stuff. And now yay, there's a big celebration, they hand out bonuses, and you get the product on market. And then some hopefully long number of years goes by.
Right.
You need to remove that product from market. And there's a lot of stuff that goes along with that also. It isn't just deciding not to sell it tomorrow.
Okay.
So that is the product life cycle. And change control actually begins as soon as you have something to change. So if you think about it in the concept, in most of the feasibility stages, there's nothing to change. You don't have any approved documents. You don't have any approved processes. You don't want to hamper scientists and engineers in the creative aspects of what they do. I mean, they should be following good laboratory practices and good engineering practices and have good notebooks and trace what they've done. And in software, you may want to have some kind of a version control type of situation to go from A to B to C or wherever. But you're really not under change control until I said you have something to change. Okay. You've put an approved document in place, a manufacturing document, a transfer document, a requirements document. Once you have something in your document system, now you're under change control.
Okay.
That's where it all really starts.
So it sounds like even though during the whole brainstorming and feasibility portion of the process, they're notating what they're doing and talking about, but they're not really creating any said documents where they would have to worry about making changes.
Right.
And that's great to note. I mean, it's good to note because sometimes people think that you have to document everything from the moment an idea is conceived.
Well, there's a difference between documenting it and documenting changes to it.
Okay.
So, I mean, certainly a scientist, and I spent 16 years in research, and back when we still had paper notebooks, so Arthur was still writing around. So, I mean, you documented everything you did.
Right.
And I would go from experiment to experiment to experiment, and I needed to be able to reproduce what I did. I needed to be able to find that information for patent purposes, and eventually the development people needed that information to begin to formulate and to begin to do whatever they needed to do. But I didn't have to go through a change control process every time I did a new experiment. But it still had to be documented. So documentation is critical. Change control really doesn't start until you have something to change.
Right. So once the product is really been tested and now you're ready to start producing it, that's when you would have all that
in the development stage, when you're still getting to the point where, again, you're verifying product requirements. You may be doing clinical trials. You may be doing anything where you've got an approved protocol, an approved set of documents. That's the key. If somebody signed off on it, you want to change it, we need change control.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's the levels of approval, right? Yeah. So definitely it sounds like change control, we're going to have an SOP for it, right? A standard operating procedure within your organization.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, can you give us a quick rundown of what should be included then in a SOP? Discuss maybe the need for hierarchy, a hierarchy approach based level of risk or priority. Talk about how we know exactly what we need to include in that.
So I have seen change control procedures from 3 pages to 300 pages.
Of course.
Both are not good.
Right.
The 3-page document does not have enough in it to guide anyone to do anything, and the 300-page document is impossible to follow.
Right.
So, but the OP, the standard SOP should outline what is needed for starting, executing, and completing the change. And it should be a process which, if it isn't easy to follow, A, no one's going to want to follow it, and B, you're going to run into compliance problems, which I think we'll talk about later. And as far as a hierarchical approach, again, what I have seen at the conferences I've been to, at the clients that I have, they have 19 levels of potential change control. And that's, again, a little loony. You walk into a situation where the demarcation between what's required for any one of those changes is a little fuzzy and somewhat arbitrary and hard to defend. So there needs to be some level of hierarchy, and I advocate 2 levels. Very simple, 2 levels. Either the change is so simple that it does not require a complete assessment of impact.
Okay.
Or it does. There's nothing else.
That's right. It's either one or the other.
It's one or the other. And those changes that do not require a full impact assessment should be very limited and clearly defined in the SOP with no exceptions.
Okay.
Things like, I want to change the title of a document. Who cares? Go ahead, change the title. You have to document the change, but I'm not impacting anything. I don't care. Okay. Another example might be, I have 3 different suppliers for salt. And for some reason, one of them goes out of business. I can remove a supplier from an incoming material specification as long as I don't change anything else.
Right.
I can't add a supplier. That's a bigger change.
Right.
I can remove one.
Right, because the supplier would have to be vetted and validated.
Right. Other stuff, right? It's a much bigger deal. So things, I could reformat a document, as an example, to make it easier to use. I could add color as long as I haven't changed the content.
Okay.
Those are these very simple, low impact or no impact changes. It should take less than a page. to
Right.
bullet point those out.
Understood.
Everything else requires the same level of impact assessment to make sure you are not breaking something else and you are thoroughly investigating the change. If you find that the change does not require a lot of impact, you just say so and justify why not.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
So it's
Totally.
very simple. No 3 levels, 4 levels. I talked to one person at a conference. They had 7 levels of changes, and that's I'm sorry.
Is that based on a prioritized risk
Something.
scale, or?
It's prioritized because people don't want to do the work. That's what it's prioritized over. And they have a hard time when an investigator or a compliance auditor comes in justifying why they put a change into that category.
Okay.
And get into a compliance risk. So by breaking it into 2 very simple, highly defined categories from a hierarchy and risk perspective, you can make it much easier for the poor people who have to sit in front of an investigator from the FDA to explain what's going on. So again, and we talk about risk, assessment of the risk of the change is always part of your risk assessment, regardless. You may have, because what you don't want to find out is the change increases the risk profile of your product. So as part of your guidance, as part of, and we'll talk a little bit about how to put this all together, that should be a risk management evaluation of your change. So again, low impact changes don't need it. Everything else does.
Understood. Makes sense. So, Alan, for our listeners, a lot of them may be very familiar with the change control process during development. So as they're trying to get their product to market, they're used to having to document these changes and go through the process. But we are talking today about actually change control for products that are already out there on the market. Is the process of change control vastly different during development and post-market? And can you highlight the differences, the major differences in change control pre and post-launch?
The short answer is there's almost no difference.
Okay.
You are still going to be looking at your change. You are still going to be evaluating why you're making that change. And if you just as a brief reminder, there are 3 aspects to any change. There's what the change is. I'm going from A to B. There's why I'm making the change.
Correct.
And there's why it's okay to make the change.
Sure.
That's true regardless of what phase of market you are. The biggest difference between on-market and developmental changes tend to be the drivers of the change. What's forcing you to make that change? So in development, you tend to make changes because you're learning something about your product as you're developing it. You discover that this amount of stabilizer in the pill is too little, too much, because you've done stability studies now and it's not stable. So you need to do something else. In the medical device universe, you're discovering that the software that's driving the instrument isn't quite doing what it's supposed to do. The pipette misses the bottle. Well, you've got to change that software to make it so it hits the bottle inside the machine. These are all done before you launch the product because you've got a document that says what it needs to do. You need to make the changes. On-market changes tend to be driven by different things. And I think that's the next subject that you were going to bring up, which was what's driving on-market changes. So
absolutely.
I can
go my mind.
I did. But the key drivers for on-market change tend to be a couple of different things. They tend to be CAPA related.
Yep.
So you've got something is not meeting specification in a laboratory. You have non-conforming product in the factory. Something's not working. So now you have to make it work. Customer complaints are another huge driver. Something's happening in the field, and usually most companies have a frequency trigger. I mean, if one customer calls you with a complaint and you don't hear about any other complaint for that same thing for 5 years, you're probably not going to do anything.
Right, exactly.
If you start to catch a trigger, whatever that happens to be, some number within a period of time for the same thing, that's going to feed back into the CAPA system typically, and you're going to try to make some change because something's not working in the field. There are market changes that happen. So a company wants to move a product into a new market. It may require new labeling. It may require new translations. It may require different regulatory submissions. all those are changes. And those are good reasons to have changes, right? Moving into a new market. There may be regulatory environment changes. I'll highlight right now the start of the IVDR, the in vitro diagnostic regulation in Europe for medical devices. A lot of products that at one time were self-declared CE marks no longer can be. So now these companies are going to have to go back and update their technical files, potentially do some verification validation work. That's all going to fall under change control. The other thing are product and process improvements, things you learn about your product once it's on market. If you think about having maybe 30 or 50,000 data points during development, now you're on market and you've got 30 million or 50 million data points, you're going to learn something. You're also going to learn about your processes. Maybe a good thing to have or happen is you need to scale up because you're selling more of it than you thought you were.
So that's a great problem to have, right?
A good problem to have. You may need to validate a new mixing tank.
Right.
You need to build more of this. So those are things that drive on market changes. They tend to either be problems or business opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense. So, and would that include things like transit? So, however you're getting your product there, literally delivery, if that's not working out.
Partly, you should have validated transit before you launch. I mean, that in an ideal world, right? You have some validated process that you've measured with trackers inside the boxes, and you know it's got to arrive. But a lot of things happen where intermediate shippers,
right,
or sub shippers forget to put the dry ice back in the box, and it shows up thawed, and the truck sits on the highway, in Arizona for a week in the sun. Now, you should have studies that show your product will tolerate that, so you're not throwing away a ton of stuff. But you may discover that your shipping, again, as you said, needs either you need to do some more stability studies to show that your product will sustain the additional temperature shifts, or you need to find a different shipper to ship your material. And again, all this is again an on-market driver for change. I throw those into the Kappa end of the universe because somebody got their product thawed and they called and complained.
Right. And I'm just thinking like sometimes these changes can be temporary in nature, right? Because perhaps you've always been using a shipping company, but all of a sudden there's a natural disaster in their part of the world and their whole fleet is, delayed. So you have to temporarily move to another, but you'd still have to go through this change control process.
Or you eat the product loss and hopefully they've gotten their trucks back and you ship with them again. I mean, that's a decision that management would make based on how much money they want to spend. I'm a firm believer in alternate suppliers and vendors.
Okay. Yes, absolutely.
Now, unfortunately, sometimes that's not possible.
Right.
A lot of times you do that.
Depending where you are in the world, where your product is.
First vendors for products, and that's a bad situation because they've got you. But again, shippers, at least you typically have some leeway with shipping. But those are all things that pushed on market changes. Absolutely.
Thank you. That great explanation. So let's talk a little bit about regulatory agencies because they still require changes be made according to approved written company policies. So we talked about the SOP, the need for it. Regulators are looking for it. And they want to make sure that the procedures where approved changes results from successful testing or thorough investigation. So what's unique about the review and documentation processes post-launch?
Again, I'll come back to almost nothing.
I'm sensing a theme here, Alan.
There's a theme here. What you do post-market in terms of an impact assessment is the same as you would do it during development.
Okay.
Typically, what companies will do is they'll put together an impact assessment guide or form, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And some of the questions during development just might not be applicable.
Okay.
So you would just say that. This is not applicable because we're still in development, and
right.
You not do that impact. Typically, once you're on market, everything's fair game. So there's almost nothing you're ever able to say there's no impact to, or we're at a phase where this doesn't matter. Everything matters post-market. So again, the form itself can be the same form. It can be, and whether that form is embedded in your change control system, it's a Microsoft Word document that you attach. However you do it and set it up so it works for you, it doesn't need to be different. Again, when you get to a question that doesn't make any sense for this change, You just say that and explain why. That's the critical part. You just can't say this has no impact.
Right. You have to back up your statements.
And it may not. That's great. But why not? And it can't be because the guy in the next cube told me or whatever the deal is. There has to be some logic behind it. Right. And again, if that's where investigators, that's what they're looking for.
Right.
Is did you have a logic behind your decision? And most of the time, that's okay, as long as you have a logic behind it. There's no guarantee they'll always agree with you, but they can't fault you for not having a process. They can't fault you for not having an SOP. They may say, well, your team made this decision. I don't agree necessarily. Okay. But You're not going to get an observation for lack of a procedure.
Exactly. Which is most important. They're looking for that.
Because it's there. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, and yes. So the other big exception, by the way, is in a post-market situation, you probably will have to do a regulatory assessment of the change, which you probably don't need to do pre-market because you're not on market yet. Any regulatory paperwork goes in for approval after all those developmental changes are done.
Okay.
Once you're on market and you make a change, you may need permission from the regulatory agencies before you implement that change. So that's an additional impact you need to look at post-market. So as an example, if you're a medical device company and you've got a PMA approval for a medical device, I make a change to that device, I guarantee you I probably have to get permission from the FDA to make the change. So I've got to put a supplement in with all my changes and get permission, and that can be a 30-day, 60-day, 180-day notice. If it's a 510K, I may have to write a new 510K for that product if it's a big enough. Or maybe it's just an add to file at the end of the year. But your regulatory people need to make that assessment. Pre-market, they don't need to do that because it's all going in with the paperwork at the end anyway.
And in some cases, you may be working with a totally different set of regulatory people or a new country, right? Like, so if you're trying to expand your market into Japan, let's say, I happen to know they have a very lengthy process for getting medical devices on market in Japan. So
they also have different stability rules. So you'll have done all your stability studies and you go to Japan and it's not good enough.
Right. They want to see like 3 years of testing or something like that, as opposed to whatever you've done.
Saudi Arabia is a difficult market to get into sometimes. Some countries, like Russia, require a certain amount of your product to be manufactured there.
Oh, okay.
You have to transfer manufacturing. So yes, regulatory changes in different countries are huge, but even in the same country, you may need to be filing paperwork.
Right. Oh, yes. Right. And that makes sense. I mean, if you're making a change to your product, then they need to know about it.
and potentially approve it.
And approve it. Yeah. Right. Of course.
So that's the other biggest difference between pre and post market is that regulatory piece.
So once a medical device is on market, manufacturers are required to conduct post-market surveillance following the launch. In that time, changes may come up, which you've alluded to already, that may be necessary based on functionality, customer satisfaction, or material availability, et cetera. You did mention this. But in your experience, what is different between proactive versus reactive changes? Because we hear a lot about that, especially in QRM systems, right? You want to be proactive instead of reactive. So can you talk about that a little bit?
The difference, and this is going to sound a little strange, the difference is fun. Proactive changes are fun. It's scaling up, it's product improvements, it's better manufacturing. These things tend to be planned, they tend to be budgeted, they tend to get a team assigned to them. Reactive changes is a fire drill.
Oh, right. Yes.
It is. It's a complete fire drill. You have product that either you can't manufacture, so you're not supplying the market because you've got issues in the factory. You have testing issues. You've got CAPA going on. Heaven forbid you get a recall.
Right. Yeah. And it happens.
Wait, trust me, I've lived through them. It is 6 months of your life you will never get back. So the biggest difference in those two things is whether or not you are there 24/7 for 6 weeks to try to get the problem solved, or it's something that you've planned, you put a team together. And yes, there's always a time constraint because management wants it done yesterday because it's going to mean more money.
Of course.
Bigger markets, more efficient manufacturing, customers are going to be happier because they're going to get more functionality, but it tends to be a more controlled process than reacting to the emergencies. And in the 15 years that I worked on market support, quality assurance, and I managed that area, the only people who lasted more than 3 months were those people who thrived in that kind of chaos. If you didn't, don't work on market support because most of your changes are emergencies. The filler goes down. The capping machine doesn't work. Some suppliers change plastic on you, and now you've got to do stability studies again. It's this constant. It's the problem of the day. Sometimes it's just the problem of the hour. So
okay.
I loved the environment. It was very dynamic. It's something that every day is different, and it's never boring.
Right. So those folks are the ones that are cut from the same cloth as the people who work in the ER.
Yes. Basically what you're doing is you're basically triaging your patient. And when you've got potentially hundreds of products running on multiple lines, it can get to be an interesting day. And nothing breaks until Friday afternoon.
So it sounds like, we always want to be on the proactive side if we can.
And this is where things like statistical process controls come in. If you're monitoring your process and you're starting to see drift, and you can go in and say, hey, let's fix this before it goes off the rails.
Right.
A, it's cheaper.
Exactly.
And B, it prolongs people's lifespans who are working in the factory.
On both sides of that. Yeah.
That's the biggest difference.
Okay. Sometimes it's difficult to visualize, I would guess, the total impact that a change is going to have on every aspect of the whole, right? So we've talked about times drivers for change, but I've seen some design traceability matrices be especially useful for tracking all the possible different impacts of a proposed change. So we talk about all the things that can go wrong. You think about them ahead of time and sort of lay that all out. Can you talk about this and other tools, which might be great for identifying true effects of a change?
So the tools that I found most effective are and I'm going to use the word simple because ours was 8 pages long, but a very simple form. And again, that form can be embedded in your change control system if you have the ability to do that. It can be a Microsoft Word document that is attached to whatever documentation you got for the change. But it's basically your universal. I call it a universal impact assessment form.
Right.
And it'll have some space to put, what product line it is, what the change is. Right. I'm going from A to B. Why am I making the change? And at that point, you start filling out questions. There's no justification because that's going to fall out of all those impact questions. And one person cannot fill that out because no one person has the expertise to answer all of those questions. I mean, the person who's driving the change may be the technical support scientist assigned to that on-market product. It may be the marketing person. It may be someone in production.
Okay.
They don't necessarily understand the impact to validation or the impact to your product requirements or the impact to the regulatory aspect of the change. So it really requires a team effort to get all these things filled out. And again, if there is no impact, great. You just say that and explain why not.
Right.
You also need to have somewhere in that form, and of course, what you're really putting together is an impact assessment and a plan. You're saying, these things have no impact, but the things that do, here's what I'm going to do about those aspects that have impact. And I'm either going to do some studies, or I'm going to do stability, or I'm going to do another validation, or I'm going to extend this validation, whatever I need to do to show the change is going to work. And then I have to come back to that form. And I've got to fill in what I did and where that information is stored. So, yes, it was impact to validation. I had to redo a mixing validation. C validation package 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 XBC, and that's stored in the validation library. I don't have to have it there. I just need to point where it is. In an audit situation, you hand that packet to an investigator, and they're going to go, yep, you did this. Oh, you did this. Oh, here's where it is. They might want to see a few pieces.
Right.
But after they see the first one, when they see all the rest of them are the same, they check a box and move on. Because their company's doing the same thing for every change, every time. And again, they may not agree with all of your decisions, but they cannot argue with the fact that you have a robust, constant, and consistent procedure and process for looking at the impact of all of your changes. And this includes, regulatory changes, medical risk, all your risk management, including production risk management, patient risk management.
Right.
And that way it's all in one place. And let's face it, no one is with a company forever. And
exactly.
the last thing you want
is to figure out what the last person did.
Pulled into an audit and ask, well, how come they did this, and have no clue as to why.
I can imagine that's not a good conversation.
No. Been there, done that. Not a good conversation. And not only do you look like an idiot, but the company looks really bad.
Well, and I would imagine then the regulators regulatory agents want to dig a little more, because once they see that you're not standardized, that draws more concern, I would think.
It absolutely true. And when a regulator or an auditor comes in to look at your site, 90% of the time they're going to ask for three things. They're going to ask for a list of all of your customer complaints.
Yep.
They're going to ask for, from the last time they were here until now.
Yeah.
They're going to ask for a list of all of your CAPA, and they're going to ask for a list of all your changes. And why those three things? It is all of your dirty laundry in one place. They don't even have to dig. It's all there in a list.
Exactly.
You want to see, you had a complaint. Did it feed into CAPA? Did that CAPA have a solution?
Right.
Did that solution end up in change control? Did you do an impact of that change? And did you solve the customer's problem?
Right.
So, and they're going to look at all of it. And the more you have an organized, consistent, same-looking, that's not a technical term, but same-looking face each time you see it, the more confidence they have that you know what you're doing.
Right. Consistency and transparency are critical.
Right. And none of us are going to remember everything. I don't care how many of these you've done. Without that guidance to walk you through it, you're going to forget something.
Right.
And that's a problem, because that could be the thing that makes or breaks everything else.
Which is why it's so important to have your system in place, set up ahead of time, and you know what procedures you're following every time.
Every time. Right.
Yeah.
And when you put these systems into place, you will get some kickback. I almost guarantee it.
Of course.
It's a lot of work. And the first edition of this form or this guidance will not be the last edition. And, when we set these up, we actually had office hours once a week when it went into place. We had feedback from users, and we incorporate, you missed talking about this. Oh, we did. Update the form, put that in. This should be in two places, not one. Fine. And you begin to build it. And after a course of some time, you will have a very robust, very reliable process. But the first edition, it's not going to be the ultimate edition. Let's put it that way. And that's okay. That's okay.
As long as you're working on it, right?
Well, that's true. Yep, absolutely.
Well, Alan, we have covered a lot about post-market surveillance and change controls today. But to help our listeners be better prepared, what have you identified as the most common pitfalls to change control compliance?
So, upper management who doesn't want to spend the time and the money to do it the right way. And I hate to say that. Most of the people, I'm going to call it in the trenches,
right,
want to do the right thing.
Of course.
CAP is expensive. It takes time. And so does proper change control. It is expensive and it takes time. The other thing is lack of organization in the system. So there's not having these forms that you can easily fill out. Not having, I'm going to call them local experts that are available to help out people coming in. Hey, I don't know how to do this. Can you help me with it? You don't have to be on the team, but providing some of that guidance to people to make sure that they're doing the appropriate types of analysis for the impact. Again, it's a lot of work.
It is, and so to your point from earlier in the discussion, the easier you can make it, the better off you are, because I can just imagine if it's ridiculously hard or confusing to follow along with whatever protocol you have in place, that's when you start to cut corners or
Absolutely.
take chances on things because you're running out of time or you don't have the resources to figure it out.
And the resourcing is another big issue. To do this the right way, you need the right resources, and it may be resources back in R&D to do studies.
Right.
But again, they have to be willing to do it. Management has to understand that you're going to be calling on a whole variety of skill sets in order to do an appropriate impact assessment. So it's when you have management buy-in, and that usually happens, by the way, after the first successful audit.
Right.
Where they come in and the auditor sends a little, I've seen a comment from the FDA back to us saying, wow, we think your change control system is outstanding. Show that to management. And the other thing that works is, can you give them an ROI, a return on investment?
Right.
Yeah, we can. We'll get product back on market faster. We'll have happier customers, more placement, whatever you need to do. And the faster you fix a problem, the happier your customers are going to be. So there's
and the faster you can get it back on market, right? Like,
this is not rocket science.
Right. Exactly. It's
to be a
marketing 101, really.
Marketing 101. Right.
Awesome. Before we wrap today, Alan, any tips or suggestions that we haven't covered that you'd like to let our listeners know about?
And we sort of alluded to this. And I mentioned that no one person can do this by themselves, and it kind of has to be a team approach.
Right.
My suggestion is, and it works, is a dedicated on-market support change team. Now, these aren't not necessarily the people who drive the bus.
Right.
Right. The person who wants the change for whatever reason is the one who kind of drives, it kind of acts like the project manager.
Of course.
Dedicated pool of people who know your product, understand the regulatory environment that product is in, understand the manufacturer of that product, and can be pulled together and are dedicated to doing this work. And you're not trying to pull people from their other job to do on-market change work. And you want people from you want technical support type scientists, you want engineers potentially, validation people, QA, because we sign everything, regulatory, marketing. I mean, if I'm changing labeling, I need marketing there.
Right.
Customer facing.
Exactly.
They're going to want to approve on any labeling changes. I may need medical writing, the people who put together PMA submissions or supplements who actually come up with the labels. I certainly want people from manufacturing who if the problem is in manufacturing, I don't run the instrumentation down there. I need someone who knows what's going on.
Right.
And a dedicated core team on market support looks like an extravagance at first, but it absolutely will pay back dividends tenfold in how fast you can get your products back on market, and you're not pulling other people away from their jobs.
It sounds like a brilliant proactive move to me, but how common is that? Do you see that? Yeah, I was going to say, because
it's not, and it should be. I've seen it. It was common when I was working at Abbott.
Right.
We had a dedicated on-market support team, and it worked extremely well. A lot of companies either don't have the resources or management hasn't dedicated the resources because they haven't seen the benefit.
Right. And that's usually 9 times out of 10, I would bet that's why it doesn't exist.
Yep. And again, it takes as I mentioned earlier, there's a sort of I hate to put it, kind of a warped personality that wants to work in that environment.
Right.
Because it's truly like drinking from a fire hose every day. But if whoops, you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, I lost my video.
Uh-oh.
Um,
I can still see you.
I can't. I don't know where it went. But anyway.
That's okay.
But it's a great way. I loved working in that environment, and it was very rewarding. And you saw the direct results of your work every day.
Right, and that's reward in itself, right, Alan?
I think so.
Yeah, excellent.
I think so.
Well, listen, we are just about out of time, but I thank you so much for your time with us, Alan, and sharing all of your information. We will have your contact information in the show notes if folks have questions. Absolutely. So thank you for being with us today. And thank you also to our producer, Ed Sullivan, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. To our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast player of choice and leave us a review. And don't forget to share with your friends and colleagues. You can find out more by visiting ivtnetwork.com or emailing customer service at ivtnetwork.com. And we hope to see you next week when we have another great episode of Voices in Validation. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.